This episode of the Monocle Daily was first broadcast on Thursday, the 3rd of October, 2024.
It's 2300 in Dhaka, 2000 in Beirut, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Raleigh. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Further Israeli strikes on Beirut. Where does this end? Could the US presidential election already have been decided by a hurricane? And an overt search for covert agents. I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Ingar, Thordar and Terry Stiatsny will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the Danish novelist Janne Teller on publication eve of her new novel. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Ingar Thordar, Chief External Relations Officer at the Ocean-Born Foundation, former Senior Editor at BBC and CNN, and Terry Stiatsny, the apolitical journalist and author. Hello to you both.
Hello. Hello.
Ingar, first of all, welcome to the Daily for the very first time. And as is customary when we welcome people to the Daily for the very first time, introduce yourself, if you would, to our listeners. Who are you? How did you get here, etc.?
First of all, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. Well, I am here by invite, and that's a great honour to be that. But my background in journalism, obviously, for 20 years, running newsrooms at the BBC and CNN. But I have now moved into the climate space, and I work for the Ocean-Born Foundation. And our main purpose is to bring a blended finance approach to bridging the mighty gap that exists in restoring and protecting our oceans.
In London, though you are, does this feel like any kind of a homecoming for you? I think you are our first actual Icelandic panellist on the Daily, and the Icelanders are, of course, by necessity, a great seafaring people.
We are, of course. I mean, when you're brought up by the ocean, you learn to respect and love it. And I think that's where my passion comes from. But I mean, the ocean is also a very strategic solution to our climate crisis. So it's natural for us to focus on that.
Well, welcome to the show. We will have more from you shortly. Terry, you are a more familiar voice to Daily listeners. What have you been up to lately?
What have I been up to? I've mostly been writing, but my favourite thing I've been up to in the last little while is I went to see Patti Smith play the slightly unlikely surroundings of St Paul's Cathedral, which was just absolutely fabulous. The acoustics in there, you can imagine, are amazing. And Patti Smith, for all her age, she's an absolute tiny woman and still has a voice that absolutely belts out songs. And it was sort of obviously not a religious experience, but it was pretty damn good.
But she was in no way, being Patti Smith, I guess, would help with this, but in no way overawed by the surroundings.
She was a little bit, actually. She did seem to say, I'm kind of amazed by this. But then you realise that Patti Smith is kind of quite used to these big surroundings, because she did an amazing cover of Bob Dylan's Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, and she had all the lyrics printed out. And she said, my trouble is, last time I did this, I messed up because I didn't remember the lyrics.
It's a very wordy song.
It is a very long, wordy song. It was several pages, and she'd forgotten her reading glasses. She said, the last time I sang this was when Bob Dylan got his Nobel Prize for Literature in front of the King of Sweden. And so it's kind of like, OK, you're quite used to the big gigs.
Well, we will have more from both of you shortly, but we will start in Lebanon, where Israeli airstrikes are continuing against what Israel claims are Hezbollah-related targets in Beirut and elsewhere. Further south, Israel is warning residents of several Lebanese towns and villages to leave as soon as possible, including Nabatea, home to perhaps 100,000 people. Estimates of the number of Lebanese already displaced by recent fighting range as high as 400,000 people, which is getting on for a tenth of the country's population. Well, first of all, we are joined by Hannah McCarthy, who is in Beirut. Hannah, given that it's often the case that situations such as the one you're in make the least sense to the people who are in the middle of them, what have you been able to understand of what has happened today?
Sure. Well, there was intense targeting of Beirut's southern suburbs last night. About 17 strikes were reported on southern Beirut, including, and not just on southern Beirut, but one in Bashour, which is, central Beirut. It's very nearby. Everyone was very, it's somewhere that many people would pass by on their day-to-day. day-to-day life. And again, people are very concerned about how central Beirut is now being targeted in a way that makes people feel like they do not know where is safe anymore. Earlier in the week, you mentioned that Nabatea has been given an evacuation order, but earlier in the week, on Monday morning, I met a family who had fled from Nabatea 2 weeks ago. They had made efforts to keep themselves safe. They had rented an apartment in Kola, and the apartment below them was struck by a drone strike that killed 4 people. And, they were terrified. After finding that apartment, they basically decided we're going to go stay on the beach because they do not know where is safe.
So do you get a sense in Beirut now of how many people are on the move from the south of the country especially?
I mean, well, just driving around, you notice it under many of the highways. People are camping there along the beach. There's all these makeshift tents. I was passing through Martyrs Square just a few hours ago, and there's members of charities there giving out food to people. And I went to a church shelter this morning as well, and a priest there said that they're getting 100 people a day turning up there, and they just have to turn them away. They just don't have capacity for them.
I mean, going back to what you were saying earlier about people starting to feel like nowhere in Beirut was safe, are you hearing from people who are talking about leaving Beirut? I mean, I know that while Lebanon is not Gaza, it's not a big country, and there's not really like another border you can safely cross, given that the only other neighbouring country is Syria. But are people nevertheless talking about going elsewhere?
Well, I mean, 50,000 people are estimated to have crossed into Syria because they've decided it's safer than staying in Lebanon. Particularly Syrians in South Lebanon, they're terrified about the prospect of an Israeli invasion. So I spoke with a Syrian family earlier in the week who were going back to Aleppo. They said, look, it's safer there for us, with the war going on in Lebanon. You are also seeing people going up to Tripoli, people from the south going up there. And again, it's also particularly difficult for migrants as well, because of how chaotic the public shelters are being organised. So I was speaking to someone today who said, they were trying to organise shelter for domestic workers who'd been kind of, abandoned in Beirut, and, they were brought up to Tripoli to a shelter there. But then the local municipality said they don't want them at the shelter. This is only for Lebanese. And then they had to come back down to Beirut. So, I mean, this is a wartime situation at a time when there is a very dysfunctional state apparatus that is very ill-equipped to deal with this type of situation.
I mean, on the subject of that dysfunctional state apparatus, while all this has been going on, what have we been hearing in the way of response, or indeed seeing in the way of response from the Lebanese government, such as it is?
I mean, they did announce that public schools have been converted into shelters. There's kind of, but again, it's very ad hoc government responses to the situation. NGOs are largely filling the space. There's been kind of a series of announcements from, donor countries who are increasing the amount of aid they're giving to Lebanon. Because again, there's like huge issues with, having a war in Lebanon, which is already a host country for, over 1 million Syrian refugees and, 100,000 Palestinian refugees as well.
Hannah McCarthy in Beirut, thank you for joining us. We'll bring in our panel now, Ingar Thordar and Terry Stiatsny. Ingar, first of all, you were in Lebanon last time that there was a reasonably sized actual kinetic war between Hezbollah and the Israel Defense Forces. This was in 2006 when Israel invaded Lebanon relatively briefly. Do you get a sense yet of how what we're seeing now might compare to that?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that the scale now is completely different. As you say, it was a relatively brief incursion by the Israelis at the time. And, and the evacuation was mainly to Beirut. Now it seems to be going a lot further north of the country. So, and the amount of people that are on the move, I know we said about 400,000, but some figures like OCHA's have gone up to 1 million of internally displaced people. And we shouldn't forget that this is on top of the existing refugees and migrants that were in Lebanon, which weren't there in 2006. The Syrians, which are, again, depending on whose figures you believe, anything between 800,000 and 1.5 million in the country. So that is in addition. Many of them in the Bekaa Valley, which is, of course, on the southern part of the country. And, and then the Palestinians who live there. So the crisis is a lot bigger, over a lot bigger scale than it was then, I would say. And, and there's again, Hannah sort of alluded to the infrastructure problem. I mean, the toll that the refugee crisis over the last few years has taken on Lebanon is extreme. And so their ability to cope with this right now at a time when their economy has more or less collapsed is, it's an enormous burden to put on a country at the size of Lebanon.
Terry, are we starting to get a sense here that Israel thinks it has an opportunity to dispense with its two most, I guess, proximate enemies, both Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, in one go? We've seen the Israeli action escalate from the pager explosions of the other week to the assassination of Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah on last Friday. We've seen the assassinations of dozens at this point of senior Hezbollah officials. Israel does seem to have decided that this is it.
Yeah, yes. I mean, they do certainly seem to be, this seems to have been a planned operation, as you say, going first trying to get rid of the communications network, then, acting against the individuals who are running Hezbollah, and now, trying to move into that territory. So that's obviously how Israel hopes it will go. Obviously in the past when they've gone into Lebanon, that hasn't necessarily ended well, and it has all been much more complicated and much more long-lasting than that. But I think, the question at the moment is what is the end game here as far as Israel is concerned, and how long do they have to keep this operation going on in the hope of getting what they want?
I mean, just finally on this one before we move on, Ingar, that criticism or concern that Terry raises there has been raised many times about Israel's actions in Gaza, that question of, what do we think victory looks like? Where does this end? What do you anticipate the day after being like? Do you get any sense of what idea they have in their head for what the future beyond whatever this is might be?
If we knew what the Israelis were thinking right now, that would be interesting. But, I think that there's a couple of things to consider here. First of all, we shouldn't rule out Iran's response. So far they obviously have attacked Israel once. There is nothing to say that they won't do that again. So even if they get rid of Hezbollah and Hamas, there is still the sort of response from Iran and how they will deal with that. I think that, it seems to me to be pretty obvious from what Netanyahu is saying, that he wants to get rid of these proxies, especially Iran's proxy and Hezbollah, but also their Hamas. Now, whether or not they'll be able to do that, I don't know. We are a year into the operation in Gaza almost, and they are still fighting there. So, Lebanon is a big country, and now they've really attacked Iran's main ally in that part of the world. So, I think that it's anyone's guess right now.
Well, we will have much more on that across all our shows tomorrow, and I suspect all next week as well. To the United States now, where the damage done by Hurricane Helene is beginning to be calculated. At least 194 people are now confirmed dead, but hundreds more are missing. Estimates of damage to homes, business and infrastructure have already cleared $6 billion. What remains to be seen, and what may never indeed be fully understood, is the degree to which it will disrupt the US presidential election, from which we are now just 32 days. North Carolina, the state hit hardest by Helene, is a key swing state, and so is Georgia, also battered by the storm. Terry, there's probably not a wrong answer to this question, you'll be glad to know, but between just the incredible disruption to people's lives, the disruption of the post, people losing their IDs and so forth, just the astonishing chaos this storm has unleashed, it might actually already have decided this election.
It's quite interesting if you look at the numbers. From the North Carolina government, the electoral board basically the state election board said, this is what you do if you haven't got your ballot. This is what you do if you haven't registered. This is what you do if you've got to move. And they actually had the numbers of people who are affected in the disaster counties. There's 1.28 million voters, of whom 293,000 are registered Democrats and 480,000 are registered Republicans. So, that would suggest that those people who are affected by this are going to be disproportionately Republican. The thing is, if you're trying to save all of your belongings from a disaster and you've got to move somewhere else, is voting going to be top of your mind? Are you going to want to go and vote anyway, or are you going to think, this is just another problem that I don't really need to deal with? So, I mean, it's very interesting, obviously, seeing, quite how much effort the current administration is putting into sending troops, Kamala Harris going down and serving meals. And so they're really trying to avoid the mistakes of Katrina and trying to say, look, we are here, the government can help you, and obviously concerned about, the electoral effects of that.
I mean, Inga, if we are applying brutally cynical political calculus to this, does a natural disaster, or can a natural disaster kind of play for the incumbent? Because as Terry points out, if you're in charge, you have the power to fix stuff. You can send troops, you can allocate resources, you can turn up and look concerned. If you do it right, it should work for the person in charge, shouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it could certainly swing that way. But I mean, I think apart from the logistical problems that Terry made, I think that there are other issues that this could do. I mean, first of all, climate change has not really been an issue in this campaign. I think that could shift now. It's a very polarizing topic in the US, but there could be a slightly more focus on that. They will definitely be looking at the response from the candidates to this. And I mean, both Biden and Kamala Harris, who visited recently, I think Trump was there on Monday, if I remember correctly. And what they will do will matter. But I think it's also important that they have promised more money for FEMA, the federal agency that deals with this, more troops. But FEMA is already warning that they don't have enough money for the rest of the season. And we're looking at a season that has at least 2 more months to go. So there's still a lot of things that can go wrong between now and the 5th of November. And I think the kind of final thing to kind of maybe mention on this is that, the relief efforts are going to cost an enormous amount of money that the government might not be able to siphon this quickly into the rescue efforts. And I mean, the previous sort of legislation around adaptation, for example, has proved to be grossly inadequate. So I think that will be interesting to see how Kamala will play this up in a way, because obviously it's Biden's call.
By way of confirmation, Terry, that there is nothing that the current American political climate cannot make an issue of. Politico reporting today that when Donald Trump was president, he, and I quote, initially refused to approve disaster aid for California after deadly wildfires in 2018 because of the state's Democratic leanings. But Harvey said Trump changed his mind after Harvey, this was Trump's senior director for resilience policy, pulled voting results to show him that heavily damaged Orange County, California, had more Trump supporters than the entire state of Iowa. We kind of have to hope it's not being organised along those lines this time?
Yes. Well, let's hope that, the aid and the help is going to the people who need it rather than on the basis of how people might potentially vote or not vote. And it's interesting to look at the reporting of this as well, because obviously there's a lot of coverage of, what the current administration is doing. And of course, that can cut both ways if they're seen to get it wrong. Like George W. Bush in Katrina, people thought, he really wasn't doing enough to help people. But then there also seems to be kind of a strand of opinion, which is, you're not being told the real story. They're not really doing enough from sort of Trump supporters who don't want this to do well for the administration and who want to somehow play up that in the hope that it's going wrong almost.
Well, on which note, Inga, the Trump campaign has rather quaintly launched a GoFundMe for Helene victims. It says here it's running at about $4.5 million last time I looked. Where would you be happy to assess your level of confidence about where that money might be going?
Well, I mean, $4.5 million is not going to do an awful lot for the people that have been victims of this. But I mean,
at which point, that's probably what Trump's thinking. In which case, I might as well just keep it.
Well,
exactly.
I mean, I wouldn't put it past him. But I do think there's one point to make is that this is still a rescue effort right now. I mean, there are 600 people who are still missing. So the recovery efforts might not be in time for the incumbent to look good here, because I mean, the death toll could still rise significantly. And, that's where the efforts are going right now.
I mean, can we at least hope, Terry, that things aren't so polarised that a competent relief effort, which we must hope is furnished, cannot start people maybe thinking, not just about Trump refusing to send federal funds to people who didn't vote for him, but one remembers, of course, him attempting to draw on a hurricane map in 2019 to emphasise his claim that Hurricane Dorian, despite the predictions of meteorologists, was in fact going to reach Alabama.
Well, I think Trump probably looks at the hurricane map and wonders quite how close it's going to go to Mar-a-Lago and what effect that's going to have. That's probably his main concern, possibly. But I think there's a more serious argument here, which I suppose is how much can the state do? And if you tend to be a Republican who is generally arguing the state should keep out of people's business and let people get on with it, something like a natural disaster is one of those classic examples where really you can do all the things you can to help yourself, but if a hurricane's going to knock down your house, you probably will need some help to rebuild it.
Well, let's move along to an exciting career opportunity for listeners in China, North Korea and Iran who fancy moonlighting for the capitalist running dogs of the decadent West and or the Great Satan. The CIA has posted information on how potential informants in those jurisdictions may contact the agency via its public as well as its dark web portals. Somewhat gloatingly, the announcement of this endeavour notes that, quote, "Our efforts on this front have been successful in Russia, and we want to make sure individuals in other authoritarian regimes know that we're open for business. They are maddeningly coy, however, about remuneration and holiday entitlements." Inga, would you be tempted? If they were advertising for Icelandic-speaking spooks, would you be into this?
I think I'd have to think twice about it. I'll be completely honest about that. I mean, it's really interesting. You're kind of a slight comment there about how successful this was in Russia. I mean, who says that, and what's their evidence of that? I mean,
the CIA says it, Inga, and has the agency ever in its history given us any reason to doubt what they tell us?
Do you really want me to answer that?
Terry, would you be tempted by this?
I'm fascinated by, among other ways of approaching people, they're putting this on LinkedIn. And I just imagine all these people in Iran and North Korea getting a little message from LinkedIn going, "You might be suitable for this job with the CIA." Putting this up there and going, is that really the best way to reach out? And you have to contact them, via VPNs or via the dark web, or I wonder how many people they are actually going to be able to reach of the kind of people that they would like to help cooperate with them. I'm not sure this is the best way to grab people.
I just feel a bit sorry for whoever it is at Langley has the job of fielding these, the first of these inquiries, because the amount of emails they must get from whatever the Chinese, Russian, Farsi equivalents of Mickey Mouse or IP Freely are, it's extraordinary. I mean, this is asking to have your time wasted, isn't it?
Well, I kind of think so. I mean, I saw there are a few sort of flaws in this, I think. I mean, yes, first of all, there is the trolling that is probably going to come from the state apparatuses in these areas, but they're also in some of these jurisdiction asking people to break the law in order to get in touch with them and risk their own kind of well-being and safety in those couries, and I do find that quite extraordinary.
This is why I would like to have heard a bit more about the pay and the hours.
Yes, exactly. Is it worth you actually violating your own country's rule? I don't know. And I mean, not to mention if you're actually caught doing it. I don't know.
Isn't this just going to go around in an infinite loop, because all the people who reply will already be working for the intelligence services of all the other countries and they'll say, "Hey, look, double agent joined the CIA." We'll just, go on forever.
I would definitely want a case study from Russia, I think, if I was sitting in China before I applied.
But there is a serious point here, and I think there is something to be encouraged here. It would be good, I think, if Western countries broadly did have useful intelligence assets, in countries such as Iran, North Korea and China and Russia, which may conceivably mean us harm. And I think, Terry, it's probably better that they are trying to broaden the recruitment net rather than just leaving it all to, people tapping each other on the shoulder at fancy universities, which was as was tradition during the Cold War. I was looking into other methods of recruitment, and MI6 this year won an award of some sort for an ad campaign, which was, I'm not making this up, people can go and look this up when they've finished listening to this. It's an old school web-based 16-bit game called Clues. KLOOS, in which you have to move your little character around a little low-definition town trying to find a lost dog. It is unbelievably boring, and I confess I lost interest after about 10 or 15 minutes, having made no progress with my investigation whatsoever. So a life in the Secret Services may not be for me.
They do this. I mean, the GCHQ publishes puzzles, and they have puzzle books, which presumably is to get you to say, if you're really good at puzzles or video games, come and join this, which is just a more modern version of, when they were recruiting people to go and work at Bletchley Park, the test was how quickly can you solve the cryptic crossword. And so that was what they did in those days. And now they, can you do the puzzle? Can you do the game? And they do sort of public adverts. We would like you. Have you considered a career in the Secret Services? They advertise quite a lot, I think, now.
Inga, did no one ever try to recruit you in some disreputable Beirut cocktail lounge?
No, they didn't. Neither did they do that in the Reykjavik cocktail lounges. We clearly don't pose a threat. But, the only thing I could think of with this broadening of their sort of recruitment efforts is that, I'm pretty sure that most of these services also need to include diversity of their workforce. So maybe they're desperately trying to do all of this through these methods.
MI5 and MI6 have certainly said we need more women, and this is a job you can fit around school holidays and things like that. So they do try, I think.
Well, to a noble attempt to render one of Earth's more clamorous capitals quieter, the government of Bangladesh wants to phase out habitual leaning on the car horn, beginning in the capital, Dhaka. The incessant parp of the car horn is an inescapable feature of some of the world's rowdier metropolises. This broadcaster has heard it described at least once as the Cairo brake pedal. There will first be a public awareness campaign, followed by fines for unregenerate honkers, starting at 500 taka, which is about €4 for a first offence, rising for repeat transgressions. Terry, are you a driver? If so,
yeah.
When was the last time you honked at anybody?
Probably when somebody pulled out in front of me in a stupid and annoying manner, which I looked up is against the highway code. You are not supposed to honk at people because they've just generally annoyed you. But that does seem to be it's supposed to be to alert people to danger.
No, this is true.
It's just being quite annoying.
This was all news to me because I am a non-driver, so I was looking into this earlier. I assumed, Inga, that was what the horn was for, to express your displeasure with people who had annoyed you.
Well, I'm correct. And I am a driver like Terry, and I found that all the illegal uses of it, like honking in frustration or hurry up other drivers, or when you're stationary, I'm pretty sure I've broken all of those rules. So I don't know how the Dhaka government or the Bangladeshi government is going to enforce this, really. But I'm all for driving down noise levels. I just returned from New York, and it's unbearable, the noise levels of the sirens, the honking and everything there. So it's probably a noble cause. Whether it's going to be successful, I would probably question that.
There are cities where it is definitely a thing, New York being another one of them. Beirut, I can remember going there once, and I was so diverted by it, I took a picture of it. There was a sign outside a mosque of an old school car horn in a red circle with a line through it. The idea being, could you please at least keep a sock in it while driving past a house of worship? Nobody was paying any attention to it, obviously. But there are other efforts being made, Terry. The Cambodian authorities are trying to ban musical horns because people are dancing to them.
Why?
I don't know what's on television in Cambodia. Clearly not very much. Let's all go out and dance to a car horn. But they're trying to make the point that it's not just irritating. There is the stresses, they reckon, and I can buy this, do actually have measurable medical effects. Hearing loss, high blood pressure, heart disease, and neurological disorders. Noise is bad for us.
Yes, I think it can set you on edge, but I don't know, having just been on a long train journey, I think it's low-level noise that is really, really annoying. That car horn's fine. Like New York wouldn't be. Imagine if you walked through New York and there were no car horns and no sirens. It'd be like the pandemic or something. You'd think something had gone horribly wrong. But it's low-level. People sniffing and things like that is really, really annoying. But I quite like it. You go to France and someone's just won a football match and it's just constant blaring of horns and people driving around and waving flags out of the windows of the cars. There's a place for it. Not all the time.
I just, as a final thought on this, Inga, I can't think, I haven't been to Dhaka, but I have been to cities which I think are broadly the same sort of thing. As a place more unlike Reykjavik, you could not possibly imagine. The Icelanders are not big horn honkers, I noticed. I don't think.
They're not, but they're also not brilliant driving culture in Iceland. So everyone's guilty, I guess. But I have to say, I've been to Phnom Penh and I really enjoyed those musical horns. Maybe if you're there every day, it becomes a bit of a nuisance. But it was kind of fun. It was different, and it wasn't those blaring sirens that you get in some of the Western cities. So, But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, we should all be trying to limit noise in our world. So
the garbage trucks in Taipei play Fur Release when they're reversing, which I thought was actually kind of charming. I guess context is everything, we are learning, not for the first time.
I've probably gone up and tried to buy an ice cream.
Terry Stiatsny and Ingar Thordar, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the lineage of public servants turned novelists is longer than you might guess. Winston Churchill, Hillary Clinton, in fact, and uncountable lesser-known officials have tried their hand at fiction with varying commercial success and or failure. One who has decidedly succeeded is the Danish author Jana Teller. Prior to embarking on a best-selling, award-winning career in fiction, she worked for the UN in humanitarian crises and conflict resolution. Her books retain their focus on themes of politics and war and include the novel Nothing and War, a narration of imagined flight from conflict, which she readapts for every country where it is published. Monocle's Gunnar Gronlid spoke with Jana Teller earlier and began by asking her how her shift from conflict resolution to fiction writing came about.
Now, I was always writing since I was a kid. It was like my own world. I grew up in a rather chaotic home, so my world was to create my own stories where I guess I had some control. But I didn't even know how to publish it. I come from an unacademic family. I didn't know any artists or writers. So the natural thing was to get a proper education, and I was interested in the world. But I was writing on the side, but I realized at some point, I would never be able to write the kind of stuff at a quality that I wanted if I kept having full-time jobs. So I kind of knew at some point I had to make the transition, but I still remember the exact moment where I knew this is now. I was working in Mozambique for the peace process there, and in a way I couldn't imagine anything more interesting with my background or more worthy to be, a little part, but in a big process for peace in a country. And I was sitting the night before the Secretary General was coming in to help us at a very difficult moment in the peace process, and I wrote his speaking points, as one does in those positions, what is it to say to the government or to the rebel movement. And I thought, okay, this is a fantastic thing to be doing. There's nothing else I would want to do with my background, or nothing more worthy. And yet all the time I felt, someone else can do this, I need to write my stories. And there was no way to explain that and say, okay, my stories out of imagination is more important than what I'm doing. It doesn't make any rational sense. It's just, I think some of us, we are better in doing something else that we burn for, or at least for me that was it. And I feel over time, now I understand why it just also is. I am better at inventing stories that then somehow people relate to, and hopefully on the very long process, if you change the way people think or influence it, you also make peace, hopefully, or create more harmony. It's not from day to day as you do in a peace process for the UN, but somehow it does work towards the same direction, just from another angle.
Now that you've been out of it for quite a few years and sort of getting into a lot of the same topics, I mean, what you write about is still related in many ways to the kind of work that you were doing before. Do you have a totally different perspective on those organizations and the kind of work they do and how effective they are? And do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. I think being part of them, I used to be very critical. Then you see when you work in them all the parts that doesn't work, the bureaucracy, delay, the favoritism of some kind of double agendas on the political powers. Certain big countries having too much power and, rationality going out the window often. Yet, now when I look back, I do think it's amazing that they work at all. It's amazing that something like United Nations exists, where every country in the world, every culture has a voice, and people speak to each other, even when enemy countries speak to each other in the UN. And you can gather and sometimes agree on subjects, even while you're at war at home. So it's quite amazing, and it's absolutely necessary. So yeah, I think over the long term and being away from it, I see more the advantages, and the disadvantages for me have become, smaller, or just to say, okay, they are there and you can keep working on reforming the UN and improving it. It'll never be perfect, but at least it can become a little bit better. But it's actually small compared to the large-scale benefits for them. All the conventions we have against, arms proliferation or chemical or atomic arms. There are lots of, things that are not what is talked about every day. But without those major agreements made in the UN and put on paper, the world would be much worse off. And I think the other thing I've seen again at a distance is, you have colleagues, and some you agree with or not in a setting like that. But looking back, most of my colleagues were actually amazingly idealistic. I thought I would come out and artists would be idealistic and altruistic. But later I realized, no, it was the opposite. It was actually the people I work with. They're putting their lives at danger to be out working in peace processes or giving humanitarian affairs. Or you see in Gaza how many people are killed who try to feed people in a war situation. And many of my colleagues, were in the office in Baghdad of the UN that got bombed, and some people were killed there. And we weren't earning huge amounts of money compared to the risk taken. It was not low, but it was just normal civil servant salary actually on a post. And people go and do a job because they believe in it. And I think I've come again at the retrospect to respect that a lot more. And, admire people also who stay and work in the bureaucracy with the disadvantages and daily frustrations, because I couldn't take it. So I, could take the advantage of sitting and writing my novels. But people are doing an enormously important job there.
And to ask you then a bit about your books. I mean, one of the first books that came out fairly soon after you started writing full-time is this book, Intet, which means nothing in English. And it was initially banned and then became a huge international bestseller. Why do you think that book in particular really struck both a chord and a nerve, so to speak, for people?
Well, I kind of wrote it without any, you can say, academic approach, because I wrote it initially for young people. And there's no snobbery in the reading of young people. They don't care about the writer name, or it has to be a good story, in an accessible language, an interesting thought, but something that you still turn the pages. And it not being a crime novel or anything, and it's still a literary novel, but it has that immediacy of, you can say, young adult literature, and of asking the biggest questions of what matters in life in the way 14, 15-year-olds do, without taking anything for granted. You think you can reinvent the world in a much better way than the parents and grandparents have done before. So there's something about that that's then extremely provoking, of course, for older people, because many of us have forgotten how it is to think when you are 14, 15, and also you don't want to rethink because we cannot redo the choices. I mean, I'm 60 years old now. I can't redo the choices I've made throughout my life. If I suddenly realize that maybe I had my values wrong, maybe if people are very religious, it's very tough to realize the religion that you spend your life serving might be wrong, or if it's money you work for, a career, and you think this is really in the wrong field or family, whatever it is. But young people have the advantage of saying they have to figure out what they think matters before they make that choice. So it's not provoking to ask all these questions, what in our normal society that we take for granted actually is important and what is not. So I think that's why the book was so provocative, but then also why people later have been drawn to it, because we all have these questions to the meaning of life, and we are never going to find one clear answer. So to somehow get the framework of a story that enables you to maybe deal better with these questions and find an answer for you. I don't know, as I see it, it's become why this book now is so popular.
That was Janne Teller speaking to Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid, and Janne Teller's latest novel, Are You Proud of Me, Joanna, will be available to all our Danish listeners tomorrow, October 4th. It should find an English release sometime next year. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Ingar Thordar and Terry Stiatsny, also to Hannah McCarthy at the top of the show from Beirut. Today's show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.